Welcome to the Imperfectionist podcast. My name is David Rendell, and this is episode 1. Now, I used to be a college professor, and I started every single one of my classes with a question, and that's what I'm going to continue doing here. And my question is, for everyone who's listening, what's the best strategy for becoming more successful? What's the best strategy for becoming more successful? I want to give you 3 options. The first option is fix your weaknesses. Find what's wrong. Listen to what everyone else says is wrong with you. Listen to what your boss says, what your partner says, what your kids say. Find your weaknesses, take assessments, get coaching. Find your weaknesses and fix them. That's option number 1. Is that the best way to become more successful, more happy, more fulfilled, whatever your definition of success is? Option number 2 is build on your strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses. Build on your strengths. Do more of what you're already good at. Do things that you like to do and the things that you're good at doing. Build on your strengths instead of fixing your weaknesses. And option number 3 is do a little bit of both. Option number 3 says I'll be more successful if I fix some of my weaknesses. I got to deal with them a little bit. I can't completely ignore them. I got to shore some things up. I got to make my boss happy. I have to make my partner happy. I have to adjust and adapt myself in order to be more successful in this world. But I'm not just going to fix weaknesses because it's also valuable to build on strengths. So I'm going to do a little bit of that as well. Option number 3 is do both. So what's your answer to that question? They've done a survey before, and I've done a survey before. I talk about it in my book, The Freak Factor, which you see, got to get better at pointing, right behind me there. And the most common answer is do both. The most common answer is be well-balanced, be well-rounded, right? Try to be a little bit of everything, try to be more marketable, try to be a little more palatable to most people. The most common answer is I'm going to fix some of my weaknesses. I'm going to build on some of my strengths, but I'm not going to just fix weaknesses, and I'm not going to just build on strengths. And so that's part of what I want to talk about today. The reason this is called the Imperfectionist podcast is because I think there's a lot of value hiding inside of our imperfections. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So I want to start with where I came to this. How did I get to this point? And by the way, a lot of podcasts have sponsors. This is my first episode. I'm not a famous athlete or celebrity. I haven't been on television except once. I think I was in Australia. I was on television. And so we don't have sponsored by. So what we're going to have is not sponsored by. So today I am not sponsored by Liquid Death Mountain Water. And I want to crack this open because I am, in fact, thirsty. Liquid Death Mountain Water is one of the companies that Stan Phelps and I, my co-author on Pink Goldfish, which I keep pointing in the wrong direction, kind of down behind me there. You see a little bit of pink. We talk about marketing and strategy and innovation and how companies can use their imperfections as a way to stand out in the marketplace. That's another reason this is called the Imperfectionist podcast. And Liquid Death is one of my favorite companies. Their advertisements are hilarious. They're controversial. They're outrageous. They're absolutely fantastic. And I'm thirsty up here in my studio. So the Imperfectionist podcast, not sponsored by Liquid Death Mountain Water. So I want to talk to you about how I got to this point. I'm only going to do that very quickly because you can hear that in a lot of other places. If you go to my website, you can watch my keynotes. One of the things I want to do on the podcast is talk about things that I'm not talking about in those other places, tell stories that I'm not telling in those other places. But I think it's important as we start episode 1 to give you a little bit of background. So when I was a kid, I was always in trouble for 3 things. I was always in trouble at school and at home because I couldn't sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. And my parents, my teachers, and ultimately as I got older, my employers told me that my biggest problem was my inability to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. My biggest weaknesses were my inability to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. And they all spent all of their time with me trying to get me to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. And I believed that if I was ever going to be successful, I needed to learn how to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. And as I grew up and I started working, I was continuing to have this same problem in organizations, especially in meetings: sit still, be quiet. Definitely do what you're told when you work for other people, when you work in organizations. But then something interesting started happening. I started having opportunities to stand up in front of the room for the Chamber of Commerce. I was on the board of directors trying to get involved in the community. And it was my job to stand up and do a little talk at the beginning of one of the banquets. And I started talking and people started laughing, and I was having a great time and they were having a great time. And at the end of that experience and a few other similar experiences, I started asking myself a question. I wonder if my biggest weaknesses might also be my biggest strengths. I wonder if my inability to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told is actually because I'm good at standing up and talking and doing my own thing, leading my own life, getting people's attention, taking charge of the room, taking command of the room. And ultimately, I was able to create a business as a professional speaker that I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I've been able to speak all over the world. And I now get paid to stand up and talk and run my own business, the same person who got in trouble their whole life because I couldn't sit still and be quiet and do what I was told. And so the lesson that I learned for my life, that's the basis of this Imperfectionist podcast, is that my biggest weaknesses turned out to be my biggest strengths. I'm not good at sitting still because I want to be on the move. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my Ironman tattoo. I've done 100-mile running races. I've done multiple Ironmans. I do long distance endurance races. I'm not good at sitting still because I want to be moving around. I'm not good at being quiet because I have something to say. I'm a professional speaker. I used to be a college professor. I'm a trainer. I'm a coach. Now I'm doing a podcast. I make a living talking. And I grew up constantly being told that I needed to be quiet. And I didn't want to be quiet because I had something to say, and I wasn't good at doing what I was told because I wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to be in charge of my life. I wanted to, and now I run my own business, right? I have charge of my own life. And I not only do I run my own business, but I don't even really work with other people. I have one virtual assistant, but I don't want to be day-to-day responsible for the behavior of all sorts of other people and be interacting with a lot of other people. I kind of like to do my own thing. I train on my own for my races. I run my own business. I'm at home alone. Right now, I'm doing the podcast on my own. I'm certainly going to have guests, and I'm not opposed to maybe having a co-host at some point, but I'm very comfortable doing things on my own. So what I learned was every single one of my weaknesses was actually a strength. And that got me wondering, I wonder if other people have weaknesses that were also strengths. And so those are the stories that I share in my presentations, and I'm going to share some of those stories with you today. And then I developed an assessment where I basically enabled to demonstrate that everyone has weaknesses that are also strengths. And I use those in my presentations and my workshops. I just spoke to a school in Michigan last week, Big Rapids Public School. They're a little bit north of Grand Rapids. I feel bad for them. They're just Big Rapids, and they're not as Grand Rapids, but they were awesome. And it was my second time working with them. And we did the assessment from my Freak Factor book, where people can pick their strengths and pick their weaknesses and see how the strength and weakness is connected. So this isn't just my story. This isn't just the story of some kind of outliers of interesting people that I've discovered their story, but they were already famous and successful enough for us to find out about them. This is the story of, I think, everyone. And that takes us back to that first question. What should you do if you want to be happier or more successful? Should you fix your weaknesses? Should you build on your strengths? Or should you do both? And the answer that I have, first of all, kind of transcends that question a little bit, because we're kind of changing the idea. Well, what if option number one, your weakness, is also option number two, your strength. What do you do when the weakness actually is a strength, right? And so my answer to that question is we need to build on our strengths and not try to fix our weaknesses. And that's what I'm going to show you, is because since they're connected, when you try to fix the weakness, you actually end up damaging the corresponding strength. I didn't succeed by trying to be quiet. I succeeded by getting up and talking. I didn't succeed by sitting still. I succeeded by moving actually dramatically more than most people ever will and ever would. I didn't succeed by doing what I was told and working for other people. I succeeded by going out on my own. Not only did I not fix those weaknesses, I flaunted those weaknesses. And that's going to be the main thing that we talk about today, is what does it mean to flaunt our weaknesses? What does flaunting mean? And why would we want to flaunt imperfections? So there's a few things that we're going to do each episode. I'm going to share a personal example of someone who has benefited from their imperfections, from their flaws, someone who has embraced and flaunted their weaknesses. I'm going to share a company story of organizations, because the same thing is true for organizations. Like we said earlier, not sponsored by Liquid Death, Mountain Water. Organizations can embrace and flaunt their weaknesses as well. I'm going to share, some of my favorite quotes that I've collected over the years. I'm going to share some of my favorite books. There's books on both sides of me on this middle shelf, and they're not my books. They're books about this idea that weaknesses can also be strengths, and things that we're trying to fix in ourselves and others might actually be the best things about those people. And so each week we're going to do that. I'd love to hear from some of you. One of the segments that we'll do each week is kind of a question of the week. And so if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, or you're watching this on YouTube, you can share your question or your comment in the comments. Later on, I'll give you an email address that you can send your questions or your comments to. And so that's going to be kind of the general format. I'll tell you where I'm going to be. I'll share with you one of my favorite books and talk about how, that author, usually what's going to happen is my book, The Freak Factor, says that our biggest weaknesses, or really any of our weaknesses, are also our strengths. And these other books are sort of like the Freak Factor for a particular thing, right? So Susan Cain has a book called Quiet, and it's sort of like the Freak Factor for introverts. There's a book that you can see if you're watching this, right over my left shoulder, called Messy by Tim Harford, The Power of Disorder to Transform Our Lives. So we're going to devote a whole episode to that, because messiness and disorganization and the cult of organization are sort of a big thing in most societies. But that's a book about the benefits, the upside of disorganization, about messiness. Even the word messy is not something, if you said my kid is messy, nobody would say congratulations. And so there's a lot of amazing books out there. The Wisdom of Psychopaths, we're going to talk about that one in future episodes. There's a book called America's Obsessives that talks about how obsessive people end up having a tremendous amount of success. So that's kind of how the show is going to go. I'll tell you where I'm going to be speaking, and maybe you can come out to see one of the presentations. And I'll also be, sharing. You see, if you're watching this, we'll always do kind of a shoe of the week. So I collect pink stuff, including pink shoes. And I have a huge pink shoe collection, and I wear those on stage when I do my presentations, along with a lot of my pink clothing and glasses and things like that. We'll talk more about why that is, but I'll have a shoe of the week each week. And so that'll give us a little bit of structure as we go through. So let's start with the quote of the week. And it's from Brene Brown. She actually has a book called The Gifts of Imperfection. So again, the ideas I'm going to talk about are a little bit unusual, but they're not completely unheard of. They're just not completely mainstream, and they're not the kinds of things you tend to hear at school and at work. But there are people doing some fantastic work, and Brene Brown is one of them. And her book is actually called The Gifts of Imperfection, which again seems a little bit inconsistent. That's why this podcast is called the Imperfectionist Podcast, at least until we find out that we can't use that name or something, and then we'll change it to something lame like the David Rendell podcast. But here's one of her quotes, and this is from my book, Pink Goldfish, that I wrote with a great guy named Stan Phelps, who used to work in marketing for Adidas. Brene Brown in The Gifts of Imperfection says, most of us spend our lives trying to be and seem perfect, right? So we can think that's the goal. And that's why a lot of people pick fix weaknesses as the way to be successful, because we need to get rid of our imperfections. Most of us spend our life trying to be and seem perfect. We try to protect ourselves. It can sometimes be difficult to drop the pretense and own up to your flaws and faults. It takes courage, right? So that's what we're talking about today. And I actually think it doesn't take as much courage as people think, because when you realize that the weakness is also a strength, that the downside is an upside, that the advantage or the disadvantage is an advantage, it actually changes the way you think about those things. And then you can embrace those things. You can flaunt those things. You can be excited about those things. So let's talk about the word flaunt for a second. The Freak Factor book, which is the main one that I speak about, the subtitle is Discovering Uniqueness by Flaunting Weakness. So why did I choose that word? Flaunt means to parade without shame. It means to be unapologetic. One of the primary ways that people try to get us to fix our weaknesses is they try to shame us into feeling bad about who we are and what we're doing, and get us to change by shaming us. And if we're willing to be shamed, if we're willing to be ashamed of who we are, then we end up trying to change it, trying to fix it, feeling less than, losing our self-esteem and losing our self-confidence. When I was a kid, my parents called me motor mouth. And the reason they did that was they were trying to remind me that my biggest problem was my inability to be quiet. They wanted me to some extent to be ashamed, to feel guilty about the fact that I was talking all the time, and learn that if I was going to be successful, I needed to be quiet. I was going to see that I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't be talking. And what I should be doing, and think about that word should, right? What I should be doing is being quiet. What I shouldn't be doing is talking. And so shame and guilt are one of the primary ways that we try to enforce. We try to punish people for the things that we don't want in organizations, in homes, and in schools. And then we try to reward people for the things that we do want at home, at school, and at work. And so flaunting moves outside of that process and says, I refuse to be ashamed of who I am. And in fact, I'm going to be proud of who I am. I'm unashamed and unapologetic. I'm going to stop apologizing for the fact that I can't sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. And that was a long process. When everyone in your life tells you, when everyone told me my whole life growing up that I was never going to be successful if I couldn't learn to sit still and be quiet and do what I was told, I was ashamed that I couldn't sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. I didn't know that that was going to be the roots of my success. I didn't know those were actually good qualities. I agreed with them because I had no other sense of context. And once I realized that that wasn't true, once I started having success by using those qualities instead of fighting those qualities, by embracing those qualities instead of wishing that I wasn't that kind of person, then I started flaunting. I became less ashamed, and then I became unashamed. I became unapologetic about who I was, and I started leaning into that and trying to be more of who I was instead of less who I was. I was trying to accept and appreciate. We're going to talk a lot about acceptance and appreciation in this podcast. I started to accept, and not just accept, but appreciate who I was instead of being ashamed of who I was. So that's the foundation of everything that we're going to talk about in this podcast. Is we want you to get to the point where you have the courage. You heard that in the Brene Brown quote. It can sometimes be difficult to drop the pretense that we're not perfect, or drop the pretense that we are perfect, and own up to our flaws and faults. It takes courage. And again, I don't just want us to own up to them. I want us to become unashamed and unapologetic about it. So I started with my story. I want to share one of the stories that I think encapsulates the freak factor, this idea of imperfection, the upside of imperfection, as Brene Brown calls it, the gifts of imperfection. And that's a story that we all heard as children, a movie that we've probably watched, and if you have children, a story that you've told your children, and that's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So if you think about the song, let's just go through the lyrics. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer had a very shiny nose, and if you ever saw it, you would even say it glows. Reindeer are real. Even though sometimes people think, oh, like that's a fake story. It is to some extent, but reindeer are real, but reindeer don't have shiny red noses, right? Rudolph was unusual. Rudolph was unusual, and everyone around him saw that as a weakness, as a problem. His parents in the movie, if you saw the claymation movie, tried to cover it up with mud. Santa was mortified that Rudolph had a red, shiny nose. It was seen as a huge problem for Rudolph to be that unusual, which is, again, why the book is called The Freak Factor. This idea of flaunting your weaknesses. If you do that, you're going to be weird. You're going to be unusual. You're going to stand out. And oftentimes we see uniqueness as a weakness. I'm going to say that again because this is crucial. We see uniqueness as a weakness. Forget any of the specifics about it. When someone is different, we oftentimes use weird just as a way to criticize someone. That person's really weird. That person's dressed really weird. We use uniqueness as a weakness, and that's what happens in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer story. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer had a very shiny nose, and if you ever saw it, you would even say it glows. So then what happened? Well, all of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names for being weird. They never let poor Rudolph join in any reindeer games. Now, why do a lot of people pick number one, fix weaknesses, or number three, fix weaknesses and build on strengths? Do a little bit of both. It's because we don't want to be isolated, and we don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be excluded, and we don't want to be criticized. And we think that if we can adapt ourselves to fit in, that's why Rudolph's parents covered his nose. That's why they tried to kind of fix the problem, is because we don't want to be rejected and we don't want to be excluded. And we're worried that that's what happens when we're unique. That's what happens when they're different. But let's finish the story and see why that isn't the approach that's going to be effective. So Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer had a very shiny nose, and if you ever saw it, you would even say it glows. All of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names. All. They never let poor Rudolph join in any reindeer games. And in the movie, when one of the female reindeer was willing to talk to Rudolph and give him a chance, her dad came along and absolutely destroyed Rudolph because he did not want his daughter to be with a gigantic weirdo, right? All of the other reindeer, not some, all of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names. They never let poor Rudolph join in any reindeer games. So things aren't looking good for Rudolph. He's a big weirdo. No one likes him. And even when somebody will give him a chance, that person's parents won't allow them to give him a chance because they don't want their children to be with weirdos, because weirdos aren't going to be successful. But then everything's about to change. And this is one of the most important parts of what we're going to talk about in this podcast, because some of you are still thinking, hey, Dave, I've got some weaknesses that I just need to fix. There's some things that my boss is never going to like. There's some things that my partner's never going to like. There's some things that, just aren't good about me. And there's no fix. I got to fix that. I can't have this as a weakness, but that's missing the crucial aspect of context, right? So All of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names. They never let poor Rudolph join in any reindeer games. But then one foggy Christmas Eve. Now, this is everything. Right? This is everything that we're going to talk about on this podcast. Then one foggy Christmas Eve. What just happened was the situation changed. And when the situation changed, when the external environment changed, the perception of Rudolph's weakness and weirdness changed. Then one foggy Christmas Eve, Santa came to say, Rudolph with your nose so bright. The adjective about Rudolph's nose just went from bad to good, from a disadvantage to an advantage, from negative to positive. Rudolph was the same, but the perception of Rudolph changed 180 degrees because the situation changed. And when things got foggy, a bright nose was now a valuable nose. A shiny red nose was now a valuable nose. And this is crucial. Rudolph didn't change anything. A lot of people are like, I got to fix my weaknesses. I got to change. I got to get better. I got to improve. No, you don't. What you need to do is recognize that what looks like a weakness, the red shiny nose, what looks like weirdness, the red shiny nose, was always a strength, but didn't look like a strength until you found the right situation. Then one foggy Christmas Eve, Santa came to say, Rudolph with your nose so bright, won't you guide my sleigh tonight? We just went from rejection and exclusion to moving to the head of the sleigh, to the front of the sleigh, to leading the whole thing, to saving Christmas for children all over the world. Everything changed when the situation changed and the perception of the weakness changed from a weakness to a strength, from a negative to a positive. This is crucial because sometimes people introduce me for a presentation. They'll say, Dave's going to show you how to turn your weaknesses into strengths. No, I'm not. That's what everybody's trying to do. My parents wanted me to turn my weaknesses into strengths. They wanted me to get good at sitting still, being quiet, and doing what I was told because that's what they thought was going to make me a successful person. I never turned those weaknesses into strengths. What I recognized was they already were strengths. And when I'm on stage, nobody wants me to sit still and be quiet and do what I'm told. Right? So now Rudolph is saving Christmas. Rudolph is in charge of all the other reindeer. Rudolph is leading the sleigh, because Santa's perception of Rudolph changed when the situation changed. And this is another A that we're going to talk about. We've talked about acceptance and appreciation a little bit. Another A that we're going to talk about is alignment. Everything changes when the situation changes. I'm not still in school trying to get people to accept and appreciate the fact that I can't sit still and be quiet and do what I'm told. The reason I have more success and more happiness and fulfillment as an adult is because I found and to some extent created a situation in which what looked like my weakness turns out to be a strength, and it puts the spotlight on the best things about me instead of putting the spotlight on all of the worst things about me. I haven't changed who I am. I've changed where I am. I haven't changed the person. I've changed the place. And that's what Rudolph teaches us. The success comes from finding the right situation, the situations that match. Failure is oftentimes not a problem with us. It's a problem of the fit between who we are and where we are. Then one foggy Christmas Eve, Santa came to say, Rudolph with your nose so bright. What we want is to put ourselves in situations where even potentially the same people, because Santa was not excited about it at the beginning, even the same people start to reframe who we are and what's good and bad about us, right? Because the situation changed. Won't you guide my sleigh tonight? Then what happens? Then all the reindeer loved him. All the reindeer loved him. All the reindeer that used to reject him, all the reindeer loved him. And they shouted out with glee, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you'll go down in history. Think about that for a second, right? You'll go down in history. People that go down in history, the characters that go down in history, the people we remember are the ones who flaunt their weaknesses. They accept and appreciate who they are instead of being ashamed of it. They flaunt, they're unashamed and unapologetic. And then this is crucial. The way they do that is they find situations that reward them for who they are instead of punishing them for who they are. And here's my challenge to you. We watch Rudolph when we're kids. We sing the song at Christmas. When we have kids, then we show the movie and we sing the song with our kids. And then nothing about life after that follows that belief system. that philosophy. Very few parents tell their kids it's okay to be a gigantic weirdo and you don't need to change who you are. You just need to find the right fit. They tell them, well, you just got to do what you got to do to get through school, and you just need to find a way to make your teachers happy, and you just have to study even though you don't want to, and you just have to study subjects that you don't want to, and you just have to pass your classes, and you just have to do a good job, and you just have to get into a good college, and you just have to listen to your boss, and you just have to find a way to pay your bills, and you're not always going to be happy, and you can't necessarily do what you want, and you need to be more disciplined, and you need to fix yourself, and you need to adjust, and you need to adapt, and you need to change. That's the mindset that we're taught over and over and over and over again, right? And that's the opposite of what we're talking about here on the Imperfectionist podcast. So we started with my story. I'm at least a real person as far as you know, but you're like, I don't think Rudolph isn't a real story. So let's move on from that. If you're like, hey, that's a fairy tale, that doesn't happen in real life, but I already told you how it does, right? I'm Rudolph. That story is inspiring to me because when I found the right situation, my weaknesses became strengths, and then I became happy and I became successful. And maybe I'll never go down in history, but I've had the opportunity to impact people's lives all over the world. After growing up in a trailer park in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because I discovered this truth, and that's why I'm passionate about this. And when I share this idea in my speeches, I have people come up to me and say, I wish I would have heard this when I was younger. I wish I would have heard this when my children are younger. And that's my mission. That's why I'm doing this podcast, is I can only speak to so many people at presentations, at live presentations. And through this podcast, I want to reach more people and share this with more people so that more people's lives can be transformed, and more children can hear this sooner, and more people's parents can hear this sooner, and more people's teachers can hear this sooner, and more people's bosses can hear this sooner, because it's absolutely transformational to understand that what looks like our weaknesses are also our strengths. One of the other ways to understand this concept is this concept isn't just true for us as individuals, right? It's true for me. That's what we're going to talk about in this one, but it's also true for organizations. And one of the themes for today is flaunting, again, to be unashamed and unapologetic. And so in our book, Pink Goldfish 2.0, we have a whole chapter on flaunting. It's one of the ways that companies can stand out and differentiate and innovate is by flaunting the weaknesses that they seem to have. And one of my favorite examples of that is a cough syrup company called Buckley's. Now, Buckley's is a Canadian company. Some of you might never have heard of them, but that's okay for the purposes of what we're doing here today. And Buckley's is famous for tasting terrible. In fact, most cough syrups taste bad. That's why people oftentimes prefer the pill to a cough syrup. But if you are going to take a cough syrup, you know it's going to taste bad. But what do most companies do? They make it cherry flavored, they make it bubblegum flavored, they make it minty flavored. They try to fix it, right? They try to fix it. The quote at the beginning of the flaunting chapter in Pink Goldfish 2.0 is from Gerald Weinberg. It says, if you can't fix it, feature it, right? That's flaunting. If you can't fix it, feature it, right? And that's what Buckley's does. So Buckley's wanted to expand into the rest of North America. They wanted to expand into the US market. And but what do you do when your cough syrup tastes terrible? So instead of trying to fix it, they decided to feature it. And instead of trying to make it taste better, they decided to just simply tell their potential American audience that their cough syrup tastes worse than you can possibly imagine. Right? One of their advertisements say people swear by it and at it. They say that it tastes awful because it works, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, it tastes awful and it works, right? It tastes awful and it works. But what they're really saying is it works because it tastes awful. If you really cared about getting rid of your cough, you'd be willing to endure pain and suffering in order to do it. But they didn't just tell you that it tastes terrible. They illustrated it in advertisements. And so they recorded pretend blind taste tests, the ones where people are blindfolded and they sit down and they drink 1 cup of something and 1 cup of something else, and they tell you what they prefer. And in their ads, they would have the person blindfolded, and there'd be a cup of Buckley's, and the person would tape it. And the other cup would be labeled something like trash bag leakage. Now, obviously, this is pretend, but it's funny, and you get the idea that that's a terrible, terrible thing to possibly drink. But the person would sip the Buckley's. Oh my gosh, that tastes terrible. They'd sip the trash bag leakage. That tastes terrible. But when asked which one they preferred while blindfolded in these pretend taste tests, they'd prefer the trash bag leakage. They'd prefer the sweaty gym sock drip. They would prefer something absolutely disgusting over the Buckley's. Buckley's was just rubbing your face in it. This tastes worse than you can possibly imagine. Buckley's wasn't trying to fix the flaw. They were featuring it. They weren't going to fix it. They were going to flaunt it. They were going to be unashamed and unapologetic about it, and it worked. They went from 2% of the market to 11% of the market. That's 550% growth there in Canada. That's hockey stick level growth, because they differentiated themselves. They got people's attention, and they got passionate customers by flaunting their weaknesses instead of trying to fix them. They succeeded. That was our first question. Do you succeed by fixing weaknesses? Do you succeed by building on strengths, or some combination of both? And the answer is by flaunting what seems to be a weakness, because it's also a strength. You should read some of the comments. If you want to have fun, go on the internet and go to Amazon and read some of the comments about this. One of the ones, just even the title is, ever drink drain cleaner? Now think about that, right? If most companies got a review, and by the way, this is a 5-star review that says ever drink drain cleaner, right? So imagine being a company and somebody saying this about your company online. You'd think, we've got to fix this. We've got to change this. The customer's always right. We have to make them happy. We have to turn this around, right? This person said it smells like ammonia, or like smelling salts. It's god awful. I'm not sure how it works yet, because after one taste, my body decided it would rather never cough again than to have to taste this again, right? Now, that is like, and this is crucial, because that's why it works, because some people have the mindset that if it tastes awful, then it must work, right? It works because it tastes awful. You can feel it killing your cough. You can feel it killing the germs, right? And so Buckley's is an absolutely fantastic example of flaunting it instead of trying to fix it. They even ran into a production problem one time, and some people are so committed to Buckley's that it was selling on eBay for 10 times the listed price, because people absolutely had to have their Buckley's, right? So we started with a question: do we fix weaknesses to be successful? Do we build on strengths, or do we do both? And then we took a little turn where I told you that maybe what looks like our weaknesses are actually our strengths, that what we should do is flaunt them instead of trying to fix them. I've done that. It's helped me to be successful. We teach our kids that this is true. In the Rudolph song and in the Rudolph movie, we want kids to know that it's okay to be weird. The rest of the Rudolph movie has the island of misfit toys. Again, misfit, it's right there. What's a misfit? We're telling a misfit there's something wrong with them, but the solution is in the word misfit. You just have to find the right fit. There's nothing wrong with you. Remember the movie Elf with Will Ferrell. He's a gigantic elf. He doesn't fit. He's not good at making the toys. He's too big. He's too tall. The whole problem is he doesn't fit. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just in the wrong spot, right? Being unashamed and unapologetic, flaunting means to accept and appreciate who we are. It means to accept and appreciate the other people around us, but also to find the right fit, right? To find the right fit. So I told you that I'm obsessed with pink. I'll give you a quick preview of that. That's because I have 3 daughters, and I joke about how they're gradually turning me into a woman. I joke about it, but it's largely true. For those who are listening and not watching, I'm wearing my Pink Floyd shirt. If you're not old enough to remember Pink Floyd, it's a play on Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. This says Pink Freud, and it has a picture of Freud. He's the father of psychology. A little bit of background on me. I thought I'd use this as a way to introduce that. I studied psychology in college, and I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, so I've studied my share of Freud. So I love Pink. I studied psychology, so this is a perfect shirt for me. It's also funny because the Pink Floyd album was called Dark Side of the Moon, and this shirt says Pink Floyd, Dark Side of Your Mom. If you don't know, Freud was obsessed with moms and sons and relationships between men and women. And the classic question that people, stereotypically think about asking in psychotherapy is, tell me about your mom. How is this related to your mom? So I've got my Pink Floyd shirt on, but I wanted to share one of my favorite pair of shoes, probably one of the pairs of shoes I spent the most money on in my life. I said earlier that I'm from Milwaukee, and I love sports, so I cheer for the Milwaukee Bucks. The Milwaukee Bucks won their last championship prior to the most recent one in 1972, which was a year before I was born. So I've been a Bucks fan for 50 years, and they never won until a couple years ago with Giannis Antetokounmpo, which is hard to say, and he's called the Greek Freak. So I have a Freak Factor book, the guy playing in Milwaukee, where I'm from, and I also played basketball. I'm 6'6", which you can't see on a recording, and you certainly can't see if you're listening. So I'm tall, he's tall. I'm the Freak Factor guy, and I wear shirts that say Freak. He's the Greek Freak. I like pink. He's got a pink shoe, and he plays for my favorite basketball team. So I got these pink Freak 3, Giannis Freak 3 shoes, one of my favorite pairs of shoes. If you're a sneakerhead, we'll be sharing different shoes that I have. You see some of them. I always point to the wrong side. I got used to this mirror system. But those are one of my favorite pairs of shoes, and I had to go out of my way to get those. So if you're a sneakerhead and you've got a line on some good pink shoes, go ahead and drop a comment or let me know. So I told you the other thing that I was going to do was share with you some of my favorite books. We're going to talk about this one on a different episode, but I just got this after pre-ordering it. I live now outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I started seeing these videos from Kim and Penn Holderness. Their first one that went viral was Christmas Jammies, where they posted a funny video and a song about Christmas jammies. And they were starting their own video production company. Penn used to work on the news and decided he wanted to go out on his own. And he comes up with all these hilarious parody songs. They're basically like a family version of Weird Al. And I was on their podcast a few years ago, and I keep an eye on them. And he just put out a new book. Kim and Penn Holderness put out a book called ADHD is Awesome. Right? So remember, I said I've got this idea weaknesses might also be strengths, and there's very few books that are direct competitors with that. One of the reasons I can be successful as a speaker is because not a lot of people are talking about that in the broad sense, but a lot of people are talking about that in the narrow sense, like ADHD is awesome. A diagnosable disability that we diagnose people with like it's a medical condition, and then we give them medicine to help them manage it. Penn is saying ADHD is awesome. So that's a great example. I just got this. I haven't been able to read it yet, but we're going to talk about that on a future episode. But the one book that I have read twice, I've listened to it and completely read through it. I think completely read through it twice, and have underlined it and referenced it over and over again, is called The Power of Different by Gail Saltz, S-A-L-T-Z, The Power of Different by Gail Saltz. And what she does in this book, she's a psychiatrist, and the subtitle of the book is called The Link Between Disorder and Genius. Do you feel the theme there? The link between, this is the closest thing that I've found to my book, The Freak Factor, and from somebody who's way smarter and more successful than me, somebody who's a licensed psychiatrist and works at New York Presbyterian Hospital and the Weill Cornell Medical Center. She's been on Oprah, Dateline, Good Morning America, the New York Times, and she lives in New York. This book is amazing, and I'm going to give you an overview and just share a little bit with you. But what she does in The Power of Different is she goes through every major category of what we consider mental disorders. So again, I'll try not to get too abstract here, or too medical, but there's something in psychology called the DSM. If you think your kid has autism, if you think you have ADHD, if you think you have dyslexia, you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you get tested, and they use something called the DSM. Now it's the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And by the way, listen to that word, disorders. And then they look and see, do your symptoms match the definition of the disorder? So the disorders, all the mental disorders, are laid out in that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and they tend to come in categories. Now, a lot of people diagnose themselves on TikTok. They diagnose themselves on social media. We talk about things like OCD, and somebody says, I'm really organized, so I have OCD. That's not what OCD is. I'm not here to argue about that really on the podcast, but the way you find out if you actually have one of these disorders is you go to somebody who understands what the disorder is, and they use the manual just like a regular doctor would. If you said you have COVID, they'd say, what are your symptoms? And then they'd look and see if your symptoms match the symptoms of COVID, and maybe they tell you have something else, or, those kind of things. That's how we find out all sorts of things that people have. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it kind of has categories. And the categories are learning differences, distractibility, anxiety, cycling mood, divergent thinking, and relatedness. So, for example, learning differences are things like dyslexia. Distractibility is ADD, ADHD, anxiety, you get that, obsessive compulsive, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, phobias. Then melancholy is things like depression, dysthymia, dysphoria. We know the most about depression. Mood disorders, bipolar disorder, which is just manic. And then depression, it's moving back and forth between being very high and very low instead of just being one or the other. And then things like schizophrenia. And then autism is in kind of the relatedness category. So she goes through all of the major categories of mental disorders that exist, that we understand, that we've categorized and we've labeled. And for each one, she talks about the upside. For each one, she gives examples of people who, for example, have depression, and will tell you that there's an upside to that, that have anxiety and would tell you there's an upside to that, that this diagnosable weakness, this diagnosable mental disorder, this learning disorder might also be a strength, might also be some kind of advantage. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a downside. Obviously, or there's a downside, right? This is key for what we're talking about. Is I didn't say today we don't have weaknesses, right? I said the weakness is also a strength. I'm still bad at sitting still. I'm still bad at being quiet. I'm still bad at doing what I'm told. Okay. I have all those weaknesses, and those are genuinely problematic in certain kinds of situations. I'm not good at everything. I'm not perfect. That's why this is called the Imperfectionist Podcast. So she's not minimizing the downside of this, but here's one of the interesting things. She tells you about famous people who have each of these categories of disorder: depression, anxiety, autism. She tells you about famous people who've been tremendously successful, not even though they have these disorders, but because they have these disorders, right? She argues, and so do I, that we should stop calling them disorders and start calling them differences. And remember, we think weirdness is weakness. We think uniqueness is weakness. So when you're different, we call it a disorder, when in fact it's maybe just a difference. But she doesn't just tell you about famous people because you're like, well, I'm not going to be Einstein, or it doesn't matter, I'm not Abraham Lincoln. She tells you about regular people who've had regular success, like found a good job, they're happy, they have good relationships because of the quote unquote disorder that they have because of the problem she has. And she did interviews with all these people. And one of the interesting things about her interviews is she asked a specific question every interview. She asked, if we could give you a pill that would cure your dyslexia, ADHD, anxiety, etc. If we could give you a pill that would cure your autism, if we give you a pill that would cure your disorder, your mental disorder, think about the name there, would you take it? And except for one person who had schizophrenia, because there's something very, very disruptive and very, very problematic about the hallucinations and just the psychic pain that comes with that. Except for one person with schizophrenia, every one of the other people said, I wouldn't take a pill to cure this, because I value the upside so much that I wouldn't want to lose it when I fixed the downside, right? In other words, on the whole, this is who I am, and I see the advantages, not just the disadvantages, and I wouldn't want to change everything about who I am by trying to fix this. Think about our first question. Would you fix the weakness, build on the strength, or do both? And for people with very problematic mental disorders, their answer was, now that I understand it the way I understand it, and now that I've lived my life and experienced it the way I've experienced it, I see both sides, and I don't want to lose who I am, right, by trying to fix this. I recognize the upside. And so every chapter, not only did she say that, but every chapter has a section called the gifts of fill in the blank. So the chapter on learning differences talks about the upside of learning differences. So every chapter, so this one, for example, it starts on page 34. It's called The Gifts of the Brain with Dyslexia. And that's where she talks about people that have dyslexia and what are the upsides. So for example, this one lady, her name is Beryl, Beryl, and she's a neurologist. She says, wait, is she a neurologist? Oh, she's a radiologist. And she says the same neurological processes that make it difficult for her to read text, right? Learning difference, dyslexia. The same neurological process that makes it difficult for her to read text, so her learning difference, her learning disability, her weakness, the same thing enables her to almost effortlessly find abnormalities on a radiological scan. So earlier it says, I've never seen a gift in imaging and pattern recognition like Beryl has. It's uncanny. This is one of her professors said to her, you should really think about going into radiology. So this is real life version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This person has dyslexia. They're trying to succeed in school. School is about learning. She has a learning disorder. You got to fix it. You got to get tutors. You got to learn how to read. You have to fight through it. If you can't read, you can't be successful. Instead, a professor sees the strength instead of the weakness. I've never seen a gift, a superpower in imaging and pattern recognition like you have. It's uncanny. You should think about going in radiology. Look what the professor did. The professor said, here's a situation in which you would be successful instead of unsuccessful. This is a situation in which you have a strength instead of a weakness. And then the person did and found that the weakness wasn't just an unrelated weakness. The same part of the brain that makes it hard for her to read is what makes it possible for her to be such a good radiologist. She goes on to say, I don't get mired in the details. I take in the big picture and I delegate details to others. So we're going to talk about flaunting. She says now she has supreme confidence. That's a quote. Now she has supreme confidence. So she does these interviews. Gail Saltz does interviews with these people who have the disorder that we're talking about, and then they tell their story and show you how the weakness is a strength, and then talk about the situations in which they've been able to be tremendously successful instead of unsuccessful, and how their life transformed from a lack of self-esteem and a feeling of shame to being unashamed and unapologetic, being proud of who they are instead of disappointed in who they are. So I can't emphasize the value of this book enough, especially if you, I mean, really for anybody. If you manage people, it's powerful. You definitely have people with learning differences. You definitely have people struggling with anxiety. I do coaching for companies and for leaders, and the amount of anxiety, depression, there's been multiple times I've had to help people who are dealing with thoughts of suicide and ending their own life. Whether we see this directly or not, we're all dealing with people with some kind of mental disorder. If you have children, you need to understand this. You probably have a kid with ADHD. You probably have a kid with autism, dyslexia, whatever it happens to be. Your spouse or your partner might have it. You might have it, right? This is a tremendous book, even if it just helps you get the perspective that every weakness that we have has a corresponding strength, even when that weakness, and this is crucial, and that's why I chose this in the first episode, because some of you might be thinking, Dave, you don't understand how big my weaknesses are. There's no strength that goes with my weakness, and that's why I started with this book, because if diagnosable mental disorders have an upside, then it's very likely that whatever you think of as your weakness also has a corresponding strength. Whatever disadvantage you have also has a corresponding advantage, right? So we started with, do you have success by fixing weaknesses? Do you have success by building on strengths? Or do you have success by doing both? And my answer is you have success by building on the strength that's connected to the weakness. And you do that by accepting and appreciating who you are and finding situations that reward you for who you are instead of punishing. We talked about my story, couldn't sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. Now I get paid to stand up and talk and run my own business. We talked about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, went from being rejected and isolated to saving Christmas and going down in history, being loved by Santa and all the other reindeer. We talked about how this works for companies, how Buckley's flaunted the terrible, terrible taste of their cough medicine. When I was doing the presentation once, there was actually a guy from Canada in a very small audience. I was doing a small group for digital marketers, and he shouted out, started swearing when I put Buckley's up on the screen, because he has, PTSD from growing up in Canada and having Buckley's as a child. That's just how terrible it tastes. Their slogan says people swear by it and at it. And I put a picture of Buckley's up on the screen, and somebody started swearing because that's how terrible it tastes. But they didn't try to fix it. They flaunted it instead. And remember, we are not sponsored by, I need another sip here, Liquid Death Mountain Water, in a really cool, tall aluminum can. And by the way, that's their mission. If you don't know anything about them, I'd encourage you to check them out. But they put their water in aluminum cans to stop the plastic problem that's going on in the world, and they're trying to encourage people to get their water in aluminum cans or drink them out of bottles. They've started adding a bunch of other drinks as well, but their marketing is absolutely, hilarious, outrageous, fantastic, very, very entertaining. In future episodes, I have hats and sweatshirts from Liquid Death Mountain Water, so we'll be not sponsored by them. Again, so this is it. Episode 1. Thanks for joining me, the Imperfectionist Podcast. I'm David Rendell. I'll leave you with the message that I share in all my keynotes. That is, what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. Thank you for joining me on the first episode of the Imperfectionist Podcast. I can't wait to see you again, to hear from you. Remember, share your comments on YouTube, post your comments on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'd love to hear from you, hear your comments, and answer your questions on the podcast, and start an interaction with you. And for this episode, that would be the thing. If you want to jump on there and say, I would fix my weaknesses, or I would build on my strengths, or I would do both, and tell me why, or start a conversation, or ask questions about, hey, I like what you said, but I'm not sure it would work. I definitely like to start a conversation here, and read your comment on the next episode and answer your question on future episodes. So thank you for joining me. David Rendell on the Imperfectionist Podcast. Can't wait to be with you again next week.